the next class. I'm Rob Birdsell, your host, and joined today by two very good friends. Although I don't know that I've ever had someone who isn't a friend on this podcast. So take that compliment loosely, gentlemen. Joining me today is Dan O'Keefe and Casey Carter. Dan O'Keefe comes to us from one of the best high schools in the state of New York, Cardinal Spellman High School, which I've had the privilege to be at a few times and was with Dan recently with his faculty. And Dan, welcome to the next class.
Thanks, Rob. Great to be here.
And Casey Carter, who I have worked with in various capacities for a long time, probably back to about 2005, going on 20 years, Casey. We've worked together from our time at EduVentures to Cristo Rey and your time at Faith in the Future and as president of Carter Research. But I think the thing that you should be most proud of is the work you did with Father Foley, who has been a two-time guest on this show, the founder of Cristo Rey, and Casey worked with him on his memoirs. So Casey, welcome to the next class.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me. And we're all looking forward to Father Foley's memoirs being published soon.
Yes, I think I've heard a rumor that it's getting close. It's getting close. So that'll be a great read for all of our listeners. But today we're going to dive into probably the most interesting, most consequential issue and agenda item facing schools today and facing literally everyone today. And I don't mean to be over exaggerating this, but this is just a momentous conversation that is around artificial intelligence and education. So Casey, let's just assume for our listeners for the moment that they've never used AI. Could you begin with a description of, in your viewpoint and from your research, what is artificial intelligence first? And then why is this conversation so important for educators?
Good. I'll take a swing at it and you pile on if there's something that you think will be particularly important for our audience today. I think the distinction that we can make so that this conversation can stay on track and I can answer the question relatively quickly is that artificial intelligence actually dates back hundreds of years. If you're willing to make the argument that artificial intelligence is any machine or any system that takes in information or data to produce a predictable or a proven result. So you can think of a machine as simple as a mouse trap that produces a result in the morning of a mouse being caught in it, or a calculator that can produce the predictable result of 2 + 2 = 4, to even a calculator that produces a more difficult for a human to calculate 2 + the square root of 137 divided by 13. That's a calculator, and those are forms of artificial intelligence. What we're talking about today is the rise of what we call generative AI, like examples that we've seen of ChatGPT or of Google's Gemini or Microsoft's Copilot, where instead of the machine taking in data to produce a predictable or a proven, that is to say, a falsifiable result, generative AI takes in data and information to create something new. And that becomes genuinely interesting to this conversation. The examples that people have seen are full essays or research where the data model takes in information and produces something that has not been seen before.
So just to clarify, the AI has been around for a long time. Facial recognition, your iPhone has been opened by facial recognition. That's AI for years. What you're saying, the difference or the new element that has got this to be such a big conversation is generative AI, where the computer is generating an essay, as you said, generating knowledge. So go with that then. And why is that such a big deal for education? Why is generative AI so different from predictive AI?
So excellent. So it's important for those of us who are involved in the education of the young, because we know from the Latin that to educate, ex ducere, or to lead out, is to raise something from a young seedling to then a flourishing plant, or in the case of human beings, to lead to the flourishing of a person by giving them what they need to be human. Generative AI starts to create real problems for educators because they're wondering if all of a sudden this is creating new information so that it then mimics the learning experience. So therefore, children have devices that can enable them to plagiarize and therefore we're not able to educate children. So the question that I think we can entertain later on this conversation is how to use these new technologies well. Does that address the question?
Yeah, that's great. And Dan, going along that element, I know you've written a bit and spoken a bit on from a Catholic educator's perspective around truth and the programming of this generative AI and the concern of bias and hallucinations. Could you talk a bit about your thoughts on generative AI and education and truth?
Sure. First of all, let's start by defining, objective truth and subjective truth, because it seems to be we live in a world where people don't distinguish the difference. And the best example I love to give my students is two students walk into a room. One says it's hot in here. The other says it's cold in here. Both are expressing a truth that is subjective to them. However, the objective truth could be it's 65 degrees in the room. So depending on their past experiences, one coming from a gym class where they were running around, the other is coming from, I don't know, the cafeteria where they're sitting in your refrigeration unit. Anything could affect their subjective truth. But the indisputable fact, the objective truth, is the temperature in the room. So let's start with that. Now, when you start to get into moral and ethical truths, absolutes, you will obviously have people who cannot distinguish between subjective and objective truth. And in some cases, that could affect the software that's being created. So depending on what you're asking the AI to do and the bias of the programmer, if it's more subjective truth than objective truth, you may have an answer that leans towards one direction that may not actually be true. And within a Catholic school, you take ideas like the sanctity of human life, euthanasia, abortion, the perspective of the programmer may affect the way that the AI generates the language that's used to give the answer to the questions being asked or to write the prompt that's being written. So I feel that subjective and objective truth play a huge part in how this tool is going to be used.
And if we go back to a subject you and I have written about, Dan, around the early humanists and how they felt you needed to learn in Greek because it got you closer to beauty and truth in their mind. Do you see AI as being the new Greek language, or the possibility of it being the new Greek language to help students get to this truth?
Absolutely. If you look at the way Greek language is used by the early humanists, you go back to the 15th, 16th century, it's almost as if you couldn't be part of the club unless you spoke some form of Greek, because the language had such nuances that could describe things differently. So, for example, if someone wanted to talk about love, I mean, we talk about love in the modern age. I love pizza. I love my mother. I love my dog. You're using the same verb for all of those things, but there's a clear distinction between those words. So you go into the Greek language and you start thinking about eros as a type of love, philos as a type of love, agape as a type of love. Those are clearly distinguished ways of describing that word that our English language limits. Now carry that over to artificial intelligence and generative language. Students need to be taught, teachers need to be able to communicate how best to use this new language, this generative language that's coming out, how to prompt the right questions, how to prompt the right requests from the generative IPA. And once we unlock that language, the opportunities could be endless. And again, this is new, this is emerging technology, but it is essential for the students to learn the language of AI and understand how generative language works.
But what excites me, and Casey, I love your reflection on what Dan's sharing. But when my daughters would come home and they would have an assignment to memorize all the state capitals, it would drive me insane. Why not ask them about what do we learn about the name of the state capital and why it's called that, and the critical thinking as opposed to memorization. And I would argue, teachers are concerned about AI. If they're teaching anything that AI can generate, are they teaching the right material? But Casey, your thoughts on where Dan is going with this?
Well, what's fascinating is I think Dan's intro on subjective versus objective truth is really important because a lot of our listeners might think that's a hard right turn to think that ancient Greek language, a return to the past, is actually an artificial intelligence could be the new Greek language, the flash forward to the science fiction future. The real insight there is that the ancient Greeks, as Dan was just helping us with the definition of love, have specificity in their language. What artificial intelligence gives educators access to is an extraordinary depth of what is factually or objectively true, so that we can then spend time not on the predictive results like we're talking about with the calculator, but with the creative results. And so that you can spend all the time and energy, as the ancient Greeks would say, taking you through the first level of learning, which we call grammar, or learning how to read. Then we get to logic, we get to reason using the rules of grammar, ultimately that we can get to what? Rhetoric and philosophy, using logic and grammar to do what? Discern the truth. And so it's fascinating when you think of the future of AI in education, is that so much of the rote memorization that you're alluding to, Rob, with the memorization of rivers or capitals, we can set that aside because the AI can just tell you, here's the map. This is the map of the 15th century world. Here's the map of the 18th century world. Here's the map of the 18th century maritime world. Don't worry about memorizing the rivers. Instead, let's talk about human commerce at that time, human relationships. And then the real, if you think it's a hard right turn to go from ancient Greek to artificial intelligence, it could very well be that the rise of AI teaches us how to be more human. And we can get really good at being more human in the 21st century if educators focus on what it means to be human.
That is, I think, the most exciting, where you guys kind of got to here is so awesome, because you're right. Memorizing state capitals doesn't help your humanity, doesn't help you become a better person, but learning to critically think about the truths that the AI is putting out is just wild. And, educators, we don't do change well. And, you go all the way back to Socrates, who was distrustful of books because he thought it was memorization, and you were not learning when you just read books. I think, what would your comments, Dan, to your faculty, to teachers be, as they may be fearful of this new technology? How would you address that issue of sort of the fear of what this can do to the classroom?
Well, I think there's been fear at every level in education. I mean, over the decades, we've seen the introduction of computers. You can go even back before computers, the introduction of a blackboard into the classroom, how that disrupted some of the teachers. But the introduction of computers, the introduction of the internet, smart boards, all of these technologies have come into the classroom, and there's been resistance and fear, and teachers have fought against them. Some have accepted, some have retired. But I guess the point is, once you embrace the technology, and you have to, part of that embracing process is to learn the technology, learn how to use it as a tool to educate your students. But once you embrace it, the opportunities become endless. So as we move into this new AI technology in the classroom, I think it's going to become like the smartboard or the Chromebook or the internet. We're going to understand our students are going to use it. They're going to live in it. They're going to be immersed in it. But if we can take it and use it as a tool in the classroom, it's going to open up doors that we can't even imagine at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to take a brief pause to get a word from our sponsor, and we'll be right back.
Catholic Virtual is the trusted online education partner of Catholic schools worldwide. We develop customized online learning solutions to meet the needs of our partner schools and their students. Visit our website at www.catholicvirtual.com to learn more. Now back to the episode.
And welcome back. So let's get practical, as you were just doing there, Dan. For our listeners who are mostly, but not all, Catholic school educators, how can they begin to think about this? If you're a Catholic school president or principal, what this summer should they be thinking about? What should they be doing? And Casey, we'll start with you, and then Dan, get to you as a school leader. What are you doing this summer with this?
I'll jump in. Dan was talking about the risks, and I would encourage educators this summer to do some real reading, because there actually are risks associated with artificial intelligence. And as thought leaders in our community, as people to whom others turn to give them thoughtful reflections on our current day affairs, I don't know if we can post in the notes some future reading material, but books that can describe the legitimate threat of artificial intelligence, to our species. That's not appropriate for us to talk about right now, but we've seen it with the deep fakes, right? We've seen it with the discussion of disinformation. We've seen it with the discussion of the surveillance state, where machines could then, through aggregating so many cameras, all of the data that's available on our mobile phones, these are real risks. So I don't want to just set that aside and say it's all awesome all the time, right? Just like people's lives.
Do you have any books or articles that you could recommend?
So I do, and just giving you the voiceover quickly, Human Compatible by Stuart Russell is, if there's one book that you need to read about what artificial intelligence is and what we call the problem of control, or how do you build friendliness or beneficiality into artificial intelligence, you have to read Human Compatible. If you're going to read one book on the future of this, it's already dated, it's 2017, but Nick Bostrom's book from Oxford University Press, Superintelligence, it's big, but it is exquisitely written. Human Compatible, the book I mentioned first, is so easy to read, by the man who basically is the authority who teaches teachers how to teach artificial intelligence, is one of the leading artificial intelligence researchers. And he's the one that says, we need to take a pause on this invention so that it's not our last invention. But so this is all in the answer to your question. What should we do this summer? We should just get smart on the debate and on the discussion. But then I'll pass it back to Dan, maybe, for what are the practical things that you can do to start thinking about how to actually incorporate the benefits of generative AI into your classroom.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Casey, especially when you bring up the concept of it's a legitimate threat. And, you can look at that on so many levels. You can look at it as a threat to the classroom learning environment, but also you can look at it as an existential threat to all of mankind. But let's start at the simple. I would certainly, as Casey said, have the teachers learn this summer, reading, preparation. When they come back in September, there should definitely be some type of professional development that's available to them for the integration of AI into the classroom. But probably the easiest, the smallest threat is you receive a homework assignment. Is that a homework assignment actually written by the student, or have they given a prompt to the AI and the AI produced it for them? Take it to the level of the absurd. Do teachers start then to have the AI correct the homework? So one student produces the homework from AI, the teacher has the AI correct the homework, nobody's doing anything, but the student's getting a diploma and the teacher's getting a salary. I don't think it'll get to that point, but you can see the silliness of that. However, when you start to move in, particularly in a Catholic school, and you're trying to teach morality to students, that whole issue of where is the AI going to lead you when you ask a question about, my grandmother's dying of cancer. She's 97 years old. She's a burden financially on the family. It's terrible. Let's put her out of her pain. How is the AI going to address a situation like that? Is it going to look at the sacredness and the value of human life, or is it going to look at a very secular response to, practical financial decisions, rather than looking at from a perspective of how should I address this in a moral, ethical way?
And what should they be thinking about around hallucinations, Casey? And could you just share a little bit about what, because some of our listeners may be like, wait, what do we just shift to? Or continuing that you're talking about the risks, hallucinations and bias. If you could just comment on what I think are two big risks.
Well, that's a good prompt, if you'll forgive the pun there. Dan, at the first section of our conversation, was reminding us that these large language models, which is the data set upon which the generative AI is based, or in my earlier answer, this is the information and the data that goes into the system so that it can then learn how to produce a predictable result that then starts to look more and more creative because it has layers of sophistication and layers of data on it. But the prediction or the creative work that it produces is going to be, in some part, determined by the information that you feed it. That's why it's called a large language model. It's a model where the logic of what it produces is based on the internal logic of what it has digested. So a hallucination in artificial intelligence language is when you ask the machine to produce something, and rather than produce what you thought it would produce, or something that you could say looked like a subjectively or objectively true response, it just produces something wacky. And this does happen because that's an error in the model. And well, how is it that we can objectively say that this is not a answer, in that we have PhD students who are trying to answer the question, what is the mass of Jupiter? But nobody's out there with a scale weighing Jupiter. And we have to have an argument around different methods as to how do you arrive at both the mass or the weight of Jupiter. How can you objectively say this is a hallucination? This is a conversation about how artificial intelligence can help us understand what's the educational enterprise to begin with. And the purpose of learning is to discern the truth. And we believe there's one truth in the Catholic faith. The true, the good, and the beautiful are all verities, different aspects of one truth. And I think you have an opportunity here very quickly to remind people of the philosophical and the theological end towards which we're actually educating children in school. What are schools for? They're for us to discern our purpose as made in the image and likeness of God. So again, if our readers feel like we've been taking some hard turns, this is a technology that we're going to be able to turn back on ourselves. I'll leave it there for now, but I hope I gave some people a flavor for what the hallucination is, and then how you can actually use it to say, well, are we seeing clearly? Is this not an hallucination? Are we perceiving correctly? More and more education, I think, is going to move in that direction. We're going to have time and energy for the sciences to know, is because so much of the raw labor that we have had horses to carry, machines at first, then we had combustion engines to carry the weight of construction. Well, now we have artificial intelligence to do a lot of heavy lifting so that we can spend more time truly reflecting, philosophizing, ultimately praying, and being human beings made in the image and likeness of God.
I think what you're saying, Casey. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in, Casey. Practical example, maybe. Just tell me if this is where it fits in with your thinking about hallucination. Student asks the AI prompt, write a 2-page paper on the history of Bolivia. All right. Add some quotes from historians who lived in Bolivia during that time, and then add a quote from a woman who lived in Bolivia and had her husband killed by the political government in charge, whatever the situation happens to be. And then AI generates this quote. However, in pursuing your actual data research, you find out that the woman never existed and the quote was completely fabricated. I've seen and heard examples of this from generative AI, that the importance is to respond to the prompt, not necessarily to give factual data in that response.
It's a great example. And then what we can encourage our listeners to do is to remind their students that we have an obligation to then, when you get a hallucination or you get a response that you know is objectively wrong, you're allowed to, and I believe you're obligated to, feed that information back into the language model and then say, actually, what you just said is not true, and help by then providing the appropriate information where there is objective information to be had.
Well, I think what's so exciting about this, the risks are great. I'm glad we had that part of the conversation, but it now gives educators the ability to focus in on critical thinking skills. And that, I think, is what high school students heading off to college absolutely need. I mean, the two wars that we're seeing, how are they critically thinking as opposed to just listening to the blowhards yakking about either side of either war, but to step back and think about them and not just take these hallucinations as truth. And, I think there would be 5 things that I would sort of conclude here for an educator, and then let you guys give your final concluding thoughts before we close out here. But I think this summer, as educators think about this, I would have 5 things at the top of my list for them to be building their plan around, whatever their strategy is going to be around AI. Number 1 is curiosity and creativity. I think this gives educators a chance to step back and help. How are we going to get our students curious and creative with this tool? Number 2, which is just so important in a Catholic school, but all educators, empathy. How in a world of AI do we teach students to walk in someone else's shoes? I I think AI is incredible for that. Three, I think it shifts back to a focus on written and oral communications. I've heard some educators have gone back to the blue book. I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. I never thought I would see a return to the blue book. Number four, collaboration skills, group work, a greater return to group work, collaboration skills. Talking to my daughters in college, almost all that they do is group work and collaboration, and that's all we do. Look at our work. Dan, is there anything you do on your own? You're always with your team. You're always with your faculty. I mean, it's collaboration is what work is today. And the final one that I think is most interesting and exciting is how do you ensure that your students have intellectual agility? The ability to adjust and adapt with whatever comes along, because things are coming so fast and they're going so fast and changing so fast. But that intellectual agility and putting those 5 elements into a strategic plan on AI, I think is absolutely critical. And with that, Casey, I'll go to you for your final thoughts of an educator looking at AI this summer and next year and into the future.
I love your list of the 5. I won't criticize as an educator here the order in which you put them, but I'll start with and give you a few notes on your first one around curiosity and creativity. In the beginning of our conversation, when we're making the distinction between artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence, it's because this is a machine that is creating something new. We can be rightfully led to believe that it's starting to act human. It's starting to act like us. And Aristotle reminds us that, really all knowledge begins in wonder. And we should wonder about that. And in working with artificial intelligence, I think there are parallels to our own experience where these machines are starting to behave like us. It gives us the opportunity to truly reflect on what is the right work for us to do. And we've talked on this show about there's an importance for us to speak to the truth, make sure that these models themselves are founded in truth. But I really think that this gives educators an opportunity to remind themselves. We've already spoken about being made in the image and likeness of God, but right here we have an opportunity to truly wonder about our place in the next 100 years, where these machines can be in service to us being more human, not less.
That's great, Casey. And Dan, final thoughts for our listeners that you have.
Sure. Rob, I love what you and Casey said. I'm just going to throw 2 more things in there. Essential is for us to teach our teachers how to be good coaches for prompts. Teach your students how to use the tool, teach them the language of AI. I know I said that earlier in terms of the comparisons, but it's really essential that our teachers know how to prompt and coach the prompting for that. That's the new language you need to get to. The second thing, which we didn't delve into, and maybe it's a future podcast, but realizing that every creative aspect, when you're writing a paper, there's an art to it. You're releasing a part of your soul into the created work, and allowing the AI to just say, write me a paper on Abraham Lincoln does not release artistic quality. But if some part of that student wants to put their language, their use of adjectives, they can, you can say to the AI, put 5 more adjectives into that page. But no, let the student become like an artist and realize that the tool he's using to form the work, it's not just the form and the function, but it is also how that expresses the inner feelings of the writer. And I don't think that human side, I don't think AI is there yet to have that human creative side when you're writing.
That's great, Dan. And thank you too for joining us for this conversation. And Dan, I think you're right. This is probably the beginning of, well, you and I have had a few of these. We did a webinar and wrote a paper on it. So I think this conversation will continue. But as you're both first-time guests on the next class, this will let me know if you have listened to prior podcasts, because we conclude every next class with a question for our guests, and it's the same question every time. And so, Casey, we'll start with you, so Dan gets a little head start here to think. But who is your greatest teacher and why?
So, without question, St. Augustine. And St. Augustine is the greatest teacher, and we're talking about the canon of literature that needs to be absorbed by the AI. I was actually brought back to my Catholic faith by both Plato and St. Augustine, and that's why.
what's so fun about this question is we've been doing this for 4 years, and rarely do we get a repeat, and that's a first, Casey. St. Augustine, I like it. So Dan, your greatest teacher and why?
St. Thomas More. Absolutely everything about him, everything he's written just touches the soul. We could delve into humanism so much. His expression of within his own personal life, the Catholic faith, his defense of the Catholic faith, and his clarity in just his whole existence as teacher, father, Catholic leader. I think every aspect of him has made him the model teacher for me.
That's great. Another first. So so many great teachers out there. Though Bob Abate-Marco, the president of Red Bank Catholic, I think had the best one, and he said Jesus. And that's a hard one to argue. So
I thought though that absolutely would have shown up before. I do remember once being on stage, then asked that question, and I said, "Well, she's in the back of the room," and there was Sister Sally Ann, a sister of the Sisters of the Holy Child Jesus, and the reason why she was the greatest teacher in my life is because she's the one who taught me how to read, and first we learn to read, and then we read to learn for the rest of our life.
Yeah, no, that theme has been there. Governor Bush, Jeb Bush, was on, and he said his mother, because she taught him the love for reading. And so that's a great one too. But gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the next class. To our listeners, thank you for indulging us in this super important and exciting conversation.